Arizona Territory, 1887. The sunset had painted the vast desert sky in hues of amber and crimson when Vaughn Daniels first laid eyes on what was to be his future. Perched atop his chestnut mare, sweat trickling down his sun-bronzed face, he gazed at the weathered ranch house nestled against the rugged backdrop of saguaro cacti and distant mesas. Holbrook's Promise, they called it, though at that moment, covered in trail dust from his 3-day ride from Tucson, the promise seemed dubious at best. "What do you think, Penny?" Vaughn patted his horse's neck. "Not exactly the cattle empire I described in my letters home, is it?" The modest adobe structure stood like a lone sentinel against the approaching dusk, its windows dark and uninviting. The corral needed mending, the well looked questionable, and the barn's roof sagged precariously in the middle. But it was his, all his. 23 years old and finally master of his own destiny. Vaughn dismounted, his boots kicking up dust as they hit the ground. He adjusted his Stetson, revealing a shock of sandy brown hair, and stretched his tall, lean frame. 3 years of working other men's ranches had finally yielded enough savings to purchase this forgotten corner of the territory, 40 acres, water rights to the nearby creek, and endless possibility. As he led Penny toward the barn, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement behind one of the house windows. Vaughn froze. According to the land agent in town, the property had been abandoned for nearly a year. "Hello," he called, his right hand instinctively moving toward the revolver at his hip. "Anyone there?" Silence answered him, save for the distant cry of a hunting hawk. Perhaps it was just a trick of the fading light, he reasoned, though the hair at the nape of his neck stood on end. After securing Penny in the surprisingly well-maintained barn, oddly stocked with fresh hay, Vaughn approached the house with caution, his footfalls deliberately heavy to announce his presence. The front door creaked open at his touch. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling faintly of sage, and something else, something sweet. "I'm Vaughn Daniels," he announced to the empty room. "This is my property now. I've got the deed in my saddlebag." A sound from the back room, soft, like the rustle of fabric, sent his heart racing. Drawing his revolver, Vaughn moved cautiously through the main room, noting with increasing bewilderment that the place wasn't nearly as abandoned as he'd been led to believe. A copper pot hung above a cold hearth. A handmade quilt draped across a rocking chair. Fresh herbs hung drying from the ceiling beams. Someone had been living here. Recently, he pushed the back bedroom door open with the barrel of his gun, and found himself staring into the most remarkable pair of eyes he'd ever seen. Amber. They were, like whiskey held to sunlight, set in a face that stole his breath more effectively than a punch to the gut. She stood with her back to the wall, a kitchen knife clutched in one trembling hand, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. Dressed in a simple calico dress, her dark hair falling in wild waves past her shoulders, she looked like some desert spirit conjured from his trail-weary imagination. "Who are you?" they demanded in unison. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Vaughn slowly lowered his revolver, though he didn't holster it. "Like I said, I'm Vaughn Daniels. I bought this ranch from a Mr. Peterson in Holbrook last week." The woman's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "That's impossible. No one owns this land." "I've got papers that say different," Vaughn replied, studying her more carefully now. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was a certain refinement to her features, a hint of education in her speech. She was young, perhaps 20 or so, and despite the knife in her hostile stance, something in her eyes spoke of exhaustion rather than true danger. "You're trespassing, miss," he added, more gently now. "Though I'd be happy to hear why you thought this abandoned ranch was open for homesteading." Something flickered across her face, panic, perhaps, before she lifted her chin defiantly. "My name is Zara Preston, and I have every right to be here." "Do you now?" Vaughn raised an eyebrow, holstering his gun at last. "And what exactly gives you that right, Miss Preston?" Before she could answer, a sound from outside, hoofbeats, approaching fast, drew both their attention. Zara's face went pale. "They've found me," she whispered, and the naked terror in her voice sent a chill down Vaughn's spine. Who had found her? And why was this mysterious woman hiding in his ranch house? As the riders drew closer, Vaughn Daniels realized his new beginning had just become far more complicated than he could have possibly imagined. The sun had fully set by the time the riders thundered into the yard. Through the window, Vaughn counted 3 men, their faces obscured by the gathering darkness. Without thinking, he extinguished the single lamp he'd managed to light. "What are you doing?" Zara hissed, still clutching her knife. "Buying us time to figure out what's happening," Vaughn whispered. "Who are those men?" Zara's eyes darted nervously toward the window. "Hired guns. They work for Victor Prescott." The name was vaguely familiar to Vaughn, a wealthy cattle baron whose influence stretched across the northern half of the territory. "And why would Prescott's men be hunting you?" Before she could answer, a deep voice called from outside. "Hello, the house. We know you're in there, Miss Preston. Mr. Prescott just wants to talk." Vaughn glanced at Zara, whose knuckles had gone white around the knife handle. "They don't sound like they're just here to talk." "They're not," she said bitterly. "Prescott will kill me if he finds me." The pounding of fists against the front door made them both jump. "Last chance to come peaceable-like, Miss Preston." Vaughn made a split-second decision. "Is there a back window?" She nodded, pointing to the small bedroom. "Go through it and head for the barn. Stay low. I'll handle this." Zara looked at him incredulously. "You don't even know me. Why would you help?" "Because 3 armed men threatening a woman on my property doesn't sit right with me," Vaughn replied simply. "Now go. I'll find you after." As Zara disappeared into the darkness of the bedroom, Vaughn straightened his shoulders, checked his revolver, and moved to the front door. He took a deep breath, then pulled it open, standing tall on the doorframe. "Evening, gentlemen. Something I can help you with." The 3 men exchanged surprised glances. The leader, a burly man with a prominent scar across his chin, recovered quickly. "We're looking for a woman. Dark hair, about this high." He held a hand to his shoulder. "Name's Zara Preston. Seen her?" Vaughn leaned casually against the doorframe. "Can't say that I have. Just arrived myself a few hours ago. Bought this place last week in Holbrook." The men shared skeptical looks. "Mind if we look around?" the scarred man asked, already stepping forward. Vaughn didn't budge. "Actually, I do mind. It's been a long ride, and I'm not in the mood for company. If I see any dark-haired women wandering about, I'll be sure to spread the word." The leader's hand drifted toward his holster. "Mr. Prescott don't like being disappointed, and I don't like uninvited guests." Vaughn countered evenly, though his heart hammered in his chest. "So I reckon we're both going to bed unsatisfied tonight." For a tense moment, Vaughn thought the man might draw. Instead, the leader spat on the ground and took a step back. "We'll be watching this place," he warned. "Prescott's offering $50 for information on her whereabouts." "That's so," Vaughn replied mildly. "Well, $50 is $50. If I see her, I'll be sure to collect." The men mounted their horses with obvious reluctance. As they rode away, Vaughn remained in the doorway until their silhouettes disappeared into the darkness. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding and went to find Zara. She was in the barn as instructed, hidden in an empty stall, her eyes wide in the darkness. "They're gone," Vaughn said. "For now." "Thank you," she whispered, emerging from her hiding place. In the dim moonlight filtering through the barn's slats, she looked ethereal, almost ghostly. "But they'll be back. They always come back." "Why is Prescott after you?" Vaughn asked directly. "If I'm harboring a fugitive, I deserve to know why." Zara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very small. "It's a long story." "Well," Vaughn said, gesturing to the empty barn around them, "it appears I've got nothing but time." Seated on hay bales in the gentle glow of a lantern, Zara began her tale. 6 months ago, she had been a teacher at a small school in Prescott, where Victor Prescott's young daughter was among her students. When the girl began arriving with unexplained bruises, Zara had confronted Prescott, only to discover the powerful rancher's temper firsthand. "He threatened to ruin me if I spoke of it," she explained, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "When I tried to contact the territorial marshal anyway, Prescott accused me of stealing from the school funds. No one would take my word over his." She'd fled south, working briefly at ranches and in small-town kitchens before discovering the abandoned property that Vaughn had now purchased. "I've been here 3 months, she admitted. "I thought I was safe, that I'd disappeared completely." Vaughn frowned. "How did Prescott track you here?" "I don't know," Zara said, genuine fear creeping back into her voice. "But now that they've found me, they won't stop looking." Vaughn stood, pacing the barn's earthen floor. The story was fantastic, but her fear was real enough. And something about her straightforward manner, The clear intelligence in her eyes made him inclined to believe her. "You should rest," he finally said. "You can take the bedroom tonight. We'll figure out our next steps in the morning." Zara looked up at him, bewilderment evident on her face. "You're letting me stay?" "For tonight, at least," Vaughn replied. "Though I'm starting to think I should have haggled harder on the price of this place. What with the unexpected tenants and all." The hint of a smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen, and it transformed her face entirely. Something unfamiliar stirred in Vaughn's chest. "Thank you, Mr. Daniels." "Vaughn," he corrected. "If we're going to be dodging gunmen together, we might as well use first names." As they walked back to the house, Vaughn realized that in just a few hours, his simple dream of building a cattle ranch had become entangled with something far more complex. He'd never been one to back down from a challenge, but as he glanced at the woman walking silently beside him, he wondered if he'd just made the wisest decision of his life, or the most foolhardy. Either way, Holbrook's promise was already proving to be anything but predictable. Dawn broke over the desert in a spectacular display of pink and gold, finding Vaughn already awake, seated on the front porch with a steaming cup of coffee. He'd spent a restless night on a makeshift bed in the main room, his mind racing with questions about his mysterious house guest and the dangers she had brought to his doorstep. The sound of the door opening behind him drew his attention. Zara emerged, her hair neatly braided now, wearing the same calico dress but somehow looking more composed than the wild-eyed woman he'd discovered the previous evening. "Coffee," he offered, gesturing to the pot warming on the small fire pit he'd built. "Please." She settled beside him on the porch step, accepting the tin cup he offered. "You're up early." "Ranch work waits for no man," Vaughn replied with a shrug. "Besides, I wanted to check if our friends from last night left any surprises." Zara's brow furrowed. "And did they?" "Just tracks heading back toward town. But they meant what they said about watching the place." He nodded toward the distant hills. "There's a rider up there, been sitting on that ridge since first light." Zara followed his gaze, tensing visibly. "I should go? I've already put you in enough danger." "And where exactly would you go?" Vaughn asked practically. "From what you've told me, Prescott's reach is considerable, and a woman traveling alone attracts attention." "I managed before," she argued, though without much conviction. Vaughn took a thoughtful sip of his coffee. "I've been thinking about that. If Prescott's men found you here, they likely know what you look like. But they don't know me, not really." "What are you suggesting?" "I need to go into town today anyway. Supplies, feed, proper introductions to the neighbors." Vaughn turned to face her directly. "What if I start asking around? See what I can learn about Prescott and why he's so determined to find you. Maybe there's more to this story than you know." Zara considered this, absently tracing the rim of her cup with one finger. "It's risky. Life's risky," Vaughn replied with a half-smile. "But I didn't come all this way to turn tail at the first sign of trouble." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher some hidden motive. "Why are you helping me?" Really, it was a fair question, one Vaughn had asked himself throughout the night. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's because my pa raised me to stand up for what's right. Maybe it's because I've seen men like Prescott before, rich men who think their money buys them whatever they want, including justice." He paused, meeting her gaze directly. "Or maybe it's because there's something about you that makes me think you're worth the trouble." A faint blush colored Zara's cheeks, and she quickly looked away. "I can pay you," she said suddenly, "for letting me stay. I've been tending a small garden behind the barn. And I can cook, clean. Let's start with you showing me that garden," Vaughn interrupted, rising to his feet. "Then we can negotiate terms." As they walked toward the barn, Vaughn stealing glances at the slender woman beside him. He couldn't help wondering what he'd gotten himself into. One thing was certain. His new beginning was shaping up to be far more interesting than he'd anticipated. What neither of them noticed was the glint of morning sunlight reflecting off a spyglass from the distant ridge, where a patient observer recorded their every move. Holbrook was a modest settlement with a single dusty main street, boasting the usual establishments found in any frontier town: a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and various other businesses catering to the needs of ranchers and travelers passing through. As Vaughn tied Penny to the hitching post outside the general store, he mentally reviewed his plan. Learn what he could about Prescott, purchase necessary supplies, establish himself as the new owner of the old Peterson place. And do it all without arousing suspicion about the woman currently hidden back at his ranch. The bell above the door jangled as he entered, drawing the attention of the shopkeeper and the few customers browsing the shelves. "Morning," Vaughn greeted, tipping his hat. "Vaughn Daniels. Just purchased the Peterson place south of town." The shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, brightened immediately. "Ah, Mr. Daniels. Heard someone had finally taken that old place off Peterson's hands. Edwin Miller, at your service." Handshakes and introductions followed, with the other customers, a middle-aged woman and an elderly man, welcoming him to the area with the friendly curiosity typical of small towns. "Planning to run cattle?" Miller asked as he began assembling Vaughn's order of flour, coffee, beans, and other staples. "That's the hope," Vaughn confirmed. "Got a modest stake to start with, build up from there." "Good land for it." The elderly man, who had introduced himself as Thomas Wright, commented. "Used to be fine grazing before Peterson let it go to seed." "Speaking of neighbors," Vaughn said casually, "I heard the name Prescott mentioned. Big operation." The atmosphere in the store changed subtly, a momentary pause in Miller's movements, a glance exchanged between the shopkeeper and Wright. "Victor Prescott," Miller confirmed, returning to his task with deliberate focus. "Biggest rancher in the Northern Territory. Headquarters about 30 miles northwest of here. Man employs half the county, one way or another," Wright added, though his earlier enthusiasm had dimmed. "Sounds like someone worth knowing," Vaughn prompted. The middle-aged woman, Mrs. Abigail Turner, sniffed disapprovingly. "Depends on what kind of men you admire, Mr. Daniels." Miller shot her a warning look, but Mrs. Turner was undeterred. "My husband worked Prescott land for 3 years. Broke his back for that man, and when he was injured, Prescott replaced him without so much as a parting dollar." "Abigail," Miller cautioned, "Mr. Daniels here is just getting established. No need to burden him with local disputes." But Vaughn was intrigued. "No burden at all. Always good to know the lay of the land, socially speaking." Wright cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Prescott's powerful, son. Territorial legislators dine at his table. He's not a man to cross." "I heard his men were looking for someone," Vaughn ventured, keeping his tone casual as he examined a display of work gloves. "Stopped by my place yesterday evening, in fact." The silence that followed was profound. When Vaughn looked up, 3 pairs of eyes were fixed on him with expressions ranging from concern to outright alarm. "Did they now?" Miller finally said. "And what did they want?" "Some woman," Vaughn shrugged. "Said Prescott was offering $50 for information." "That would be the schoolteacher," Mrs. Turner said quietly, earning another sharp look from Miller. "The one who accused him of..." "Now, Abigail, that's nothing but rumor," Miller interrupted firmly. "Mr. Daniels isn't interested in idle gossip." But Vaughn most certainly was. "Schoolteacher." Wright sighed heavily, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "Young woman taught at the school in Prescott. Made some allegations. Turned out she was embezzling school funds. Disappeared before she could be properly charged." "That's Prescott's version," Mrs. Turner said bitterly. "My sister lives in Prescott. She said that girl was beloved by her students. Not the type to steal a penny." Vaughn absorbed this information carefully, noting the conflicting accounts. "Sounds complicated." "It's not complicated at all, young man," came a new voice from the doorway. "It's quite simple. The woman is a thief and a liar." All heads turned to see a well-dressed man in his 40s standing at the entrance, flanked by the scarred man who had led the group to Vaughn's ranch the night before. The newcomer wore an expensive suit despite the desert heat, a gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. "Mr. Prescott," Miller stammered. "We weren't expecting you in town today." "Clearly," Prescott replied dryly, his cold gaze fixed on Vaughn. "You must be the new owner of the Peterson place. I believe my men paid you a visit yesterday." Vaughn straightened, meeting the man's stare directly. They did indeed. "Wasn't expecting a welcoming committee quite so soon. Ryder here tells me you claimed not to have seen Miss Preston," Prescott continued, gesturing to the scarred man beside him. "Is that still your position, Mr. Daniels?" "Vaughn Daniels," he replied, extending a hand that Prescott ignored. "And yes, that's still my position. Should it have changed overnight?" Prescott studied him with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing potential prey. "People's memories have a way of improving when properly motivated. As I'm sure Mr. Miller mentioned, The $50 reward still stands. The threat underlying his words was unmistakable. I appreciate the offer, Vaughn said evenly, but I've got nothing to tell. Just arrived yesterday myself. Prescott's thin smile never reached his eyes. A pity. Well, Mr. Daniels, I do hope you find success with your new venture. Ranching can be precarious work. So much depends on good relationships with one's neighbors. With that, he turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. Oh, and should your memory improve, my men will be staying at the hotel. Ryder knows how to reach me. After Prescott and his man departed, a heavy silence blanketed the store. Finally, Wright spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. You've made a powerful enemy today, son, whether you meant to or not. Vaughn completed his purchases in somber silence, his mind racing. One thing was now abundantly clear. Zara's story held more truth than fiction, and the danger she faced was very real indeed. As he rode back toward the ranch, supplies loaded in his saddlebags, Vaughn couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Twice he changed direction, taking a circuitous route home, until he was reasonably certain he had lost any potential followers. What would he tell Zara? That Prescott himself had come to town looking for her? That the entire community seemed terrified of the man? More importantly, what would they do now? Zara was waiting anxiously on the porch when Vaughn finally returned, the afternoon sun already beginning its descent toward the western horizon. She rose quickly at the sight of him, relief evident in her features. I was beginning to worry, she admitted as he dismounted. Did something happen? Vaughn unsaddled Penny before answering, taking his time to choose his words carefully. You might say that. Had an interesting conversation at the general store. He recounted the encounter with Prescott, watching as Zara's expression shifted from concern to outright fear. He was there? In Holbrook. She paced the small porch, arms wrapped around herself. This is worse than I thought. If he's come himself instead of just sending his men. There's more, Vaughn added, leaning against the porch post. The townspeople mentioned allegations you made. About Prescott's daughter. Zara stopped pacing, her back to him. What did they say? Some believe you. Others believe Prescott's version, that you stole school funds and ran. Vaughn moved closer, speaking gently now. Zara, I need to know everything if I'm going to help you. She turned to face him, eyes glistening with unshed tears. I've told you the truth. Margaret, his daughter, came to school with bruises she couldn't explain. When I asked her about them, she was terrified to answer. I'd seen enough abused children in my years of teaching to recognize the signs. And you confronted Prescott directly? Zara nodded. I thought, foolishly, that he might not realize the harm he was causing. That if someone just pointed it out. She laughed bitterly. He beat me for my trouble. Said if I ever spoke of it again, he'd make sure I never taught anywhere in the territory. But you tried to report him anyway, Vaughn guessed. I went to the territorial marshal the next day. By the time I arrived, Prescott had already filed charges against me for stealing from the school fund. Her voice hardened. The marshal suggested I leave town before things got worse. Vaughn considered this information carefully. Do you think the girl would speak up if given the chance? Tell the truth about what happened? Margaret? Perhaps. But Prescott would never allow anyone near her. Zara shook her head in frustration. Besides, it's my word against his. A schoolteacher versus the most powerful man in the territory. Not necessarily. Vaughn mused, an idea beginning to form. What if there was evidence? Something concrete that proved your story. Like what? I don't know yet, he admitted. But there must be something. Records, witnesses, something that could corroborate your account. Zara looked skeptical. Even if there were, how would we find it? I can't exactly go asking around. No, Vaughn agreed, but I can. Prescott doesn't know me, not really. And from what I gather, he's not a man who keeps his temper in check. Men like that make mistakes. This is madness, Zara said, though a hint of hope had crept into her voice. You'd risk everything. Your ranch, your reputation, possibly your life, for a stranger? Vaughn found himself stepping closer, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. You're not exactly a stranger anymore. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the danger surrounding them seemed to recede. There was something building between them, fragile, unnamed, but undeniably real. The moment was shattered by the distant sound of approaching horses. Vaughn's hand immediately went to his revolver as he stepped protectively in front of Zara. Get inside, he ordered. Hide in the root cellar I found this morning. Don't come out until I call for you." As Zara disappeared into the house, Vaughn steeled himself for another confrontation. But as the riders came into view, he realized these weren't Prescott's men. 3 cowboys approached, their manner casual, curious rather than threatening. "Hello there," called the lead rider, a middle-aged man with a graying beard. "You must be the new neighbor. Tom Reynolds. We run the box are just north of here." Vaughn relaxed slightly, though he remained watchful. "Vaughn Daniels. Just got in yesterday." Reynolds and his men dismounted, approaching with the easy camaraderie of ranchers paying a customary visit to a newcomer. "Heard someone had finally taken the Peterson place," Reynolds said, shaking Vaughn's hand firmly. "Thought we'd ride over, introduce ourselves proper." Introductions were made all around. Besides Reynolds, there was his foreman, Joel Harrison, and a younger ranch hand named Billy Cooper. They accepted Vaughn's offer of coffee, settling on the porch with the comfortable manner of men accustomed to such social calls. "Planning to run cattle?" Reynolds asked, echoing the question Vaughn had heard in town. "That's the idea," Vaughn confirmed. "Starting small, but hoping to build something worthwhile." The conversation flowed easily enough, covering the usual topics: water rights, grazing conditions, local markets. But Vaughn sensed an underlying tension, particularly when Reynolds casually mentioned Prescott's name. "Heard you met our illustrious neighbor today in town," the older rancher remarked, watching Vaughn carefully over the rim of his coffee cup. Vaughn kept his expression neutral. News travels fast. "Small town," Reynolds shrugged. "And Prescott makes an impression wherever he goes." "So I gathered." Reynolds exchanged glances with his foreman. "Look, Daniels, I'm not one to meddle in another man's business. But a word of advice from someone who's been in these parts a long while. Whatever Prescott thinks you know or have, it might be best to give it to him." "Even if I don't have anything to give?" Vaughn countered. The older rancher sighed heavily. 3 years ago, a rancher named Caldwell got crossways with Prescott over water rights. Mysterious fire took his barn. Year before that, the Mitchell place lost half their herd to rustlers that no one ever caught. "You're saying Prescott was behind it?" "I'm saying bad luck seems to follow those who oppose him," Reynolds replied carefully. "And I'd hate to see a young man with promise run into such unfortunate circumstances." The warning was clear, though whether it was delivered out of genuine concern or subtle intimidation, Vaughn couldn't be certain. Either way, it confirmed what he already suspected. Prescott's influence cast a long shadow across the entire region. As the men prepared to leave, Reynolds lingered behind while his companions mounted up. "There's a social at the church in Holbrook Saturday evening," he said quietly. "Most everyone in the county attends. Might be a good opportunity for you to meet the neighbors." He paused meaningfully. "All the neighbors?" With that cryptic remark, he mounted his horse and the 3 men rode away, leaving Vaughn with the distinct impression that Reynolds had been trying to tell him something important, something he couldn't say directly. When he was certain they were gone, Vaughn hurried to the house. "Zara? It's safe now." She emerged from the hidden cellar door, dust clinging to her dress. "Who were they?" "Neighbors," Vaughn replied, helping her up the last few steps. "And I think they might have just offered us a way forward." That night, as they sat beneath a vast canopy of desert stars, sharing a simple meal outside to escape the house's lingering heat, Vaughn outlined his emerging plan. "The church social will have everyone from the county there, including Prescott and likely his daughter." Zara shook her head emphatically. "I can't go. He'd recognize me instantly." "Not you," Vaughn clarified. "Me. I can observe, ask careful questions. Maybe even speak with the girl if an opportunity arises." "It's too dangerous," Zara insisted. "More dangerous than waiting here for Prescott to decide to burn us out," Vaughn countered. They argued back and forth as the stars wheeled overhead, neither willing to concede. Yet beneath the practical disagreement ran a deeper current, concern for each other that transcended their brief acquaintance. "Why do you care so much?" Zara finally asked, her voice soft in the darkness. "About me. About justice for a child you've never met." Vaughn was silent for a long moment, his face illuminated only by the dying embers of their small cook fire. "My mother died when I was young," he finally said. "My father did his best, but he was harsh. There were times when a teacher or a neighbor might have stepped in, might have said something, but no one ever did." He looked up at the stars, countless pinpricks of light in the vast desert sky. I always promised myself that if I ever had the chance to be the person who did speak up, I would. Zara reached across the space between them, her fingers lightly touching his hand. I'm sorry about your father. He did the best he knew how, Vaughn said simply. But Margaret deserves better. And so do you. Their eyes met across the dying fire, and something unspoken passed between them. An understanding, a connection that neither had anticipated but both now recognized. Overhead, a shooting star blazed briefly across the heavens, and Vaughn found himself wishing for something he hadn't dared hope for when he first arrived at this rundown ranch just 2 days ago. We'll need a plan, Zara finally conceded. A careful one. Vaughn smiled, turning his hand to clasp hers. I was hoping you'd say that. Neither knew what the coming days would bring, but in that moment, beneath the vast desert stars, a fragile hope began to take root, not just for justice, but for something neither had been looking for when fate brought them together. The Saturday of the church social arrived with unnerving swiftness. In the 3 days since the visit from Reynolds and his men, Vaughn and Zara had fallen into an unexpected rhythm of shared work and planning. She showed him the thriving vegetable garden she'd cultivated behind the barn, taught him which desert plants were edible, and helped repair the sagging roof that had concerned him upon arrival. In turn, Vaughn had begun the laborious process of mending fences and clearing irrigation ditches, often with Zara working alongside him. Her calico skirts hitched up practically, her dark hair covered with a wide-brimmed hat against the merciless sun. They talked as they worked, about their pasts, their hopes, the lives they'd led before fate brought them to this dusty corner of the Arizona territory. Vaughn spoke of his years working other men's ranches, saving every penny toward his dream of independence. Zara told him of her childhood in St. Louis, her determination to become a teacher despite her family's modest means, and her journey west in search of opportunity. What neither acknowledged aloud was the growing attraction between them, the lingering glances, the brush of hands that lasted a moment too long, the comfortable silence that fell between them in the evenings as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. Now, as Vaughn adjusted his best shirt, the one he'd carefully saved from the dust of travel for just such an occasion, Zara hovered nervously near the door. Remember, don't engage Prescott directly, she cautioned for perhaps the 10th time. Just observe. Listen. Yes, schoolmarm, Vaughn replied with a teasing smile, earning a reluctant grin in return. I promise not to start any gunfights in the church hall. But beneath his light tone lay genuine apprehension. This evening would be his first real foray into gathering information that might help Zara, and the stakes couldn't be higher. If I'm not back by midnight, he began. You will be, Zara interrupted firmly. But I know what to do if there's trouble. They had prepared for contingencies, a hiding place in the hills if Prescott's men came, supplies cached in case they needed to flee quickly, even a signal system using the lantern if danger approached. I still think you should wear my revolver, Vaughn said, glancing at the weapon he'd left on the table for her. Zara shook her head. I wouldn't know how to use it properly. Besides, you might need it more than I do tonight. The concern in her eyes touched something deep within him. On impulse, Vaughn stepped forward and took her hands in his. I'll be careful, he promised softly. You'd better be, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm just beginning to get used to having you around. For a moment, he thought he might kiss her, wanted to, with an intensity that surprised him. Instead, he squeezed her hands gently before releasing them. Lock the door behind me, he said, turning toward his saddled horse. And keep the shotgun close. As he rode toward Holbrook in the gathering dusk, Vaughn couldn't help glancing back at the small figure standing in the doorway of what had somehow, in just a few days, begun to feel like home. The church social was in full swing when Vaughn arrived, the modest building aglow with lantern light, the sounds of fiddle music and laughter spilling into the evening air. He tied Penny alongside the dozens of other horses and wagons before straightening his collar and stepping inside. The church's main room had been transformed with trestle tables laden with food, benches pushed to the walls to create a dance floor, and colorful bunting strung from the rafters. It seemed as though the entire county had indeed turned out, ranchers and their families, townspeople, cowboys in their Sunday best, all mingling in a display of frontier community. Mr. Daniels. Edwin Miller from the general store spotted him immediately, waving him over to where he stood with his wife. "Glad you could make it. Come meet some folks." What followed was a whirlwind of introductions as Miller enthusiastically presented Vaughn as our newest rancher to anyone within earshot. Vaughn shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and accepted a plate of food from Mrs. Miller, all while carefully scanning the room for signs of Prescott. He spotted Reynolds near the punch bowl and made his way over, nodding a greeting to the older rancher. "Daniels," Reynolds acknowledged. "Wasn't sure you'd come." "Seemed like the neighborly thing to do," Vaughn replied casually. Reynolds lowered his voice. "Prescott's by the door. Arrived about 20 minutes ago with his daughter." Vaughn resisted the urge to look immediately, instead taking a measured sip of punch. "Anyone else I should know about?" "Marshall Turner is here," Reynolds said, nodding toward a weather-beaten man with a silver star pinned to his vest. "Territorial, not local. Good man, from what I hear, though careful about stepping on important toes." Interesting, Vaughn thought. The very Marshall Zara had attempted to report Prescott to. "And the girl?" Vaughn asked quietly. "Margaret." Reynolds discreetly indicated a slender child of perhaps 11 or 12, dressed in an expensive-looking blue frock, standing rigidly beside her father as he conversed with town officials. Even from a distance, Vaughn could see that the girl's posture was unnatural, her eyes downcast, her responses to those who addressed her minimal. "Doesn't look much like a happy child, does she?" Reynolds murmured. "No," Vaughn agreed, his heart sinking. Everything about the girl's demeanor confirmed Zara's account. "She doesn't. Prescott keeps her close these days," Reynolds continued, "especially since that business with the schoolteacher." Vaughn was about to ask another question when he noticed Prescott's gaze sweeping the room. He casually turned away, pretending great interest in Mrs. Turner's description of her prize-winning preserves. The evening progressed with Vaughn carefully navigating the social currents, dancing with the daughters of local ranchers, engaging in discussions about cattle prices and water rights, all while maintaining a watchful distance from Prescott. He gathered bits and pieces of information. Confirmation that Margaret no longer attended school, but was taught by a private tutor who lived at the Prescott Ranch. Rumors that Prescott's first wife had died under mysterious circumstances. Whispers about the man's legendary temper. None of it was concrete evidence, but it all painted a consistent picture that aligned with Zara's allegations. His opportunity came unexpectedly when he spotted Margaret slipping outside alone, apparently seeking a moment's respite from the crowded hall. After ensuring Prescott was deep in conversation with the mayor, Vaughn casually made his way to the door and stepped out into the cool evening air. The girl stood at the edge of the church steps, staring up at the stars with such longing that Vaughn's heart twisted painfully in his chest. "Beautiful night," he said softly, careful to keep a respectful distance. Margaret startled, immediately tensing. "I should go back inside." "No need to leave on my account," Vaughn assured her. "I just needed some air myself. I'm Vaughn Daniels, new to these parts." The girl regarded him warily. "Margaret Prescott. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Prescott." Vaughn leaned against the church railing, deliberately casual. "I was just admiring the stars. Seems like you can see more of them out here than anywhere else in the world." Something in his non-threatening manner seemed to ease the girl's tension slightly. She nodded, glancing back up at the sky. "My teacher used to say that," she said softly, then immediately looked stricken, as if she'd said something forbidden. Vaughn's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Your teacher sounds wise." "She was," Margaret whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the church door. Miss Preston knew all the constellations. She would point them out during evening lessons. "You must miss her," Vaughn ventured carefully. The girl's face clouded. "Father says I mustn't speak of her. He says she stole from the school." "And what do you think?" The question was bold, perhaps too bold, but Vaughn sensed this might be his only chance. Margaret looked at him directly for the first time, her eyes, so like her father's in color but so different in expression, filled with a mixture of fear and unexpected defiance. "I think Miss Preston was the only person who ever—" The church door swung open, spilling light and music into the darkness. Margaret immediately fell silent, shrinking back as Victor Prescott's imposing figure appeared in the doorway. "Margaret," he said sharply, "I've been looking for you." "I was just getting some air, Father," the girl replied, her voice suddenly small and lifeless. Prescott's cold gaze shifted to Vaughn, recognition dawning in his eyes. Mr. Daniels, I wasn't aware you were acquainted with my daughter. We were just introducing ourselves, Vaughn said easily, admiring the stars. Indeed. Prescott's tone could have frozen water. Margaret, go find Mrs. Henderson. I believe she was looking for you. The girl obediently slipped past her father and back into the church without another word or glance at Vaughn. Once she was gone, Prescott's demeanor changed, a dangerous smile playing at his lips. You seem quite interested in my family, Mr. Daniels. Just being neighborly, Vaughn replied, meeting the man's stare evenly. I wonder, Prescott said, stepping closer, if your interest might have anything to do with a certain former schoolteacher. Vaughn's expression didn't change, though his body tensed imperceptibly. Not sure I follow. No. Prescott's smile widened, though his eyes remained cold. That's interesting, because my men reported seeing a woman at your ranch. Dark-haired, about the right height, keeping mostly out of sight, but definitely there. A chill ran down Vaughn's spine, though he maintained his composure. Your men have been watching my property. Let's dispense with the pretense, shall we? Prescott said, his voice hardening. You're harboring a fugitive, Daniels. A thief and a liar who made vicious accusations against me. Strong words, Vaughn remarked, his hand casually moving closer to his holstered revolver. Especially about a woman who, as I recall, was never actually convicted of any crime. Prescott's eyes narrowed dangerously. You're new here, so I'll give you one opportunity to avoid making a terrible mistake. Bring me the Preston woman by tomorrow noon, and I'll forget this conversation ever happened. Refuse, and you'll discover just how difficult life can become. Is that what happened to her? Vaughn asked, unable to contain himself. She refused your demands, so you destroyed her reputation? Forced her to flee? Something ugly flashed across Prescott's face. You know nothing about it. I know enough, Vaughn countered. I know your daughter flinches at your approach. I know men throughout the county fear you, but don't respect you. And I know Zara Preston is twice the human being you'll ever be. Prescott's hand moved toward his own weapon, but he checked himself, glancing toward the church door. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled but venomous. You've made your choice, Daniels. Don't say you weren't warned. With that, he turned and re-entered the church, leaving Vaughn alone in the darkness, the weight of what had just transpired settling heavily upon him. He had confirmed Zara's story and gained potentially valuable information about Margaret, but at a terrible cost. Prescott now knew beyond doubt that Zara was at the ranch, and he had just made his enmity toward Vaughn explicitly clear. There was no time to waste. Abandoning any pretense of social niceties, Vaughn hurried to where Penny was tethered, mounted quickly, and rode into the night, pushing his horse harder than was wise in the darkness. He had to reach Zara before Prescott's men did. The ranch was dark when Vaughn finally arrived, his horse lathered with sweat from the hard ride. No lantern glowed in the window, no smoke rose from the chimney. An unnatural silence hung over the property, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing as he dismounted. Zara, he called, drawing his revolver as he approached the house. Zara, it's Vaughn. The door stood slightly ajar, a detail that sent ice through his veins. Zara would never have left it open, not with the threats surrounding them. He pushed it wide with the barrel of his gun, stepping cautiously into the darkened main room. Zara, a soft groan from the corner, drew his attention. Striking a match with trembling fingers, Vaughn lit the lamp on the table and raised it high. Zara lay crumpled against the far wall, her dress torn, a nasty gash bleeding above her right eye. She stirred at the light, trying to push herself upright. Vaughn, she gasped. They came. Prescott's men. He was at her side in an instant, helping her to sit, his heart pounding with fury and fear as he gently examined her wound. What happened? Did they? No, she assured him quickly, understanding his unspoken question. They roughed me up, but they were looking for something. They kept demanding to know where it was. Vaughn frowned in confusion. Where what was? I don't know, Zara said, wincing as she touched her injured temple. They kept asking about the proof or the evidence. They seemed to think I had something that could harm Prescott. This was unexpected. Vaughn helped Zara to a chair, fetching water to clean her wound. Did they say anything else? The leader, the man with the scar, said Prescott was finished playing games. She shuddered at the memory. He said they'd be back tomorrow, and if I didn't produce whatever it is they think I have, they'd burn the ranch to the ground with both of us in it. Vaughn's mind raced. Evidence. Zara, think carefully. Is there anything at all, that you might have that could prove your allegations against Prescott? She shook her head, then grimaced at the pain the movement caused. Nothing tangible. I saw the bruises on Margaret, heard her fearful comments about her father's temper, but I never had any actual proof. There must be something, Vaughn insisted, pacing the small room. Prescott wouldn't be this desperate otherwise. Zara's eyes suddenly widened. My journal. Your journal? I kept a detailed record of Margaret's behavior, her injuries, things she said in class. It was part of my responsibility as her teacher. Zara pushed herself up straighter, excitement cutting through her pain. I documented everything, including dates and descriptions. Where is it? Vaughn asked urgently. I had it with me when I fled Prescott, she said. I've been using it here to record plantings for the garden, weather patterns. Her voice trailed off as realization dawned. Vaughn, it's evidence. Not conclusive on its own, perhaps, but it establishes a pattern. A record made before any allegations, with no motive to fabricate. Where is it now? In my garden supplies, behind the barn, she said. I never thought. I mean, it seemed so ordinary, I didn't consider it important. Vaughn was already moving toward the door. Stay here. I'll get it. The journal was exactly where Zara had described. A simple leather-bound book nestled among seed packets and gardening tools. Flipping through it by the light of a small lantern, Vaughn saw page after page of neat, detailed entries. The first half indeed contained observations about Margaret Prescott, clinical notes about unexplained bruises, withdrawn behavior, fearful responses to certain topics. The later pages transitioned to garden records after Zara's arrival at the ranch. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was contemporaneous documentation by a professional observer, potentially damning in the right hands. When Vaughn returned to the house, Zara had managed to clean her face and change into an undamaged dress. Despite her injury, there was a new determination in her eyes. We have to leave, she said firmly. Tonight. Prescott knows I'm here now, and he won't stop coming after us. Leave to go where? Vaughn asked, placing the journal carefully on the table between them. If we run, we're just confirming his version of events. You become the fugitive he's painted you as. And if we stay, we're likely to be dead by tomorrow night, Zara countered. Vaughn ran a hand through his hair in frustration. There has to be another way. Some way to use this information, to force Prescott to back down. He's too powerful, Zara said bitterly. Who would stand against him on the word of a discredited schoolteacher and a newcomer rancher? A memory from the social flashed in Vaughn's mind. Maybe someone who's already suspicious. Someone with the authority to act if given sufficient cause. What are you thinking? Marshall Turner was at the social tonight, Vaughn explained. Reynolds said he was territorial, not local, which means he doesn't answer directly to Prescott's influence. Hope flickered briefly in Zara's eyes before doubt extinguished it. The marshal already turned me away once. Because it was your word against Prescott's, Vaughn said, tapping the journal. But now we have documentation. And I spoke with Margaret tonight. You did? Zara leaned forward eagerly. What did she say? Not much before Prescott interrupted, but enough to suggest she would corroborate your story if given the chance to speak freely. Vaughn paused, considering. The marshal might be willing to investigate if presented with enough preliminary evidence to justify it. But how do we reach him? Zara asked practically. He'll be back in the territorial capital by now. Vaughn thought for a moment. Reynolds. He seemed to respect the marshal, and he's no friend to Prescott. He might know how to contact him. They talked late into the night, formulating a plan that was equal parts desperate and daring. By the time the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they had made their decision. They wouldn't run. They would stand their ground and fight, not with guns, but with truth. As Zara finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep in the chair by the dying fire, Vaughn watched her with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something that had been growing steadily since the moment he found her in his bedroom with a kitchen knife. Whatever happened in the coming days, he knew with sudden clarity that he wanted her in his life, not as a temporary ally against Prescott, but as something permanent, something lasting. The realization should have frightened him. Instead, it filled him with a sense of purpose stronger than anything he'd felt before. Come what may, he would protect her, and together, they would build a future on this land, his land, which was rapidly becoming their land in his mind. under these vast desert stars. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when Vaughn set out for the Box Art Ranch, leaving Zara with strict instructions to hide in their prearranged location at the first sign of Prescott's men. The journal was securely tucked inside his vest, close to his heart. Reynolds was already at work in his corrals when Vaughn arrived, supervising the branding of spring calves. The older rancher's eyebrows rose at the sight of Vaughn's approach, taking in his visitor's haggard appearance and obvious urgency. "Daniels," he greeted, stepping away from the work to meet Vaughn at the fence. "You look like you've had an interesting night." "You might say that," Vaughn agreed grimly. "I need your help, Reynolds. And I need to know I can trust you." Reynolds studied him for a long moment. "Come inside. Whatever you've gotten yourself into, it sounds like a conversation best had in private." In Reynolds' modest ranch house, over strong black coffee, Vaughn laid out the entire situation. Zara's presence at his ranch, her allegations against Prescott, the attack by Prescott's men, and the journal documenting Margaret's abuse. Reynolds listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing little. When Vaughn finally finished, the older rancher sat back in his chair with a heavy sigh. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, son." "I didn't stir it," Vaughn corrected. "I just happened to buy property where one of the hornets was hiding." A ghost of a smile touched Reynolds' lips. "Fair enough." He drummed his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "And now you want to contact Marshal Turner. Can you help? Do you know how to reach him?" Reynolds nodded slowly. "He's a friend, of sorts. Stays at my place when he's in this part of the territory." The rancher fixed Vaughn with a penetrating gaze. "But are you certain about this course? Prescott isn't a man who forgets his enemies." "I'm certain," Vaughn said without hesitation. "What he's done to Zara, what he's doing to his own daughter, it can't stand. Someone has to take a stand. And you're willing to risk your ranch? Your future here?" "What kind of future would it be?" Vaughn asked quietly. "If I turn my back on what's right? What kind of man would that make me?" Reynolds studied him for a long moment before nodding, apparently satisfied by what he saw. "I can get a message to Turner. He can be here by tomorrow, maybe the day after." He hesitated. "But can you hold out that long? If Prescott's men are planning to return today?" "We'll manage," Vaughn said, though uncertainty gnawed at him. "We don't have much choice." As he rose to leave, Reynolds placed a hand on his arm. "Wait here." The older man disappeared into a back room, returning moments later with a rifle and a box of ammunition. "Take this. My father's buffalo gun. Shoots farther and hits harder than that revolver you're carrying." Vaughn accepted the weapon with gratitude. "I'll return it when this is over." "See that you do," Reynolds said gruffly. "And Daniels? When Turner arrives, send word. I want to be there." The ride back to his ranch was tense, with Vaughn constantly scanning the horizon for signs of Prescott's men. By the time he crested the final rise overlooking his property, the sun was high overhead, beating down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. The ranch appeared peaceful from a distance, too peaceful. No smoke rose from the chimney. No movement disturbed the stillness of the yard. With growing apprehension, Vaughn approached cautiously, Reynolds' rifle at the ready. When he reached the barn, he called out softly, "Zara?" "It's Vaughn." No answer. Heart pounding, he checked the hiding place they had agreed upon, a small root cellar beneath the barn floor, but found it empty. The house, too, showed no signs of Zara's presence. Her few possessions remained, but the woman herself was gone. On the kitchen table lay a folded piece of paper. With trembling hands, Vaughn opened it to find Zara's neat handwriting. "Vaughn, Prescott's men were watching the ranch. I saw them from the garden when I went to check on the plants. I feared they would intercept you upon your return, so I've gone to draw them away. Don't worry, I know these hills better than they do after 3 months of exploring them. I'll meet you at the place where we watched the meteor shower 2 nights ago, after sunset. If I don't arrive by midnight, it means I've been captured. In that case, take the journal to the marshal yourself. Whatever happens, know that these few days with you have meant more to me than I can express. You've restored my faith in good men." Zara Vaughn crumpled the note in his fist, torn between admiration for her courage and frustration at her recklessness. Drawing Prescott's men away meant putting herself directly in danger. He quickly gathered supplies, water, ammunition, food, and saddled Penny once more. The place where we watched the meteor shower was a small mesa about 3 miles from the ranch, offering a commanding view of the surrounding territory. If Zara had indeed managed to evade Prescott's men, It was a defensible position where they could wait for nightfall. As he rode out, Vaughn couldn't help thinking of Zara's final words in the note. They echoed his own unspoken feelings, feelings that had grown with startling speed, yet felt more genuine than anything he'd experienced before. He only hoped he would have the chance to tell her so in person. The mesa rose from the desert floor like the prow of a great ship, its flat top providing a natural fortress with visibility for miles in every direction. Vaughn approached cautiously, alert for any sign of Prescott's men, but the landscape remained eerily still beneath the afternoon sun. He secured Penny in a sheltered hollow at the base of the mesa, where a small spring provided water and scrubby vegetation offered some concealment. Then, Reynolds' rifle in hand, he climbed the steep path to the summit, his eyes constantly scanning for movement. The top of the mesa was empty, with no sign of Zara. Finding a position that offered both shade and a clear view of the approaches, Vaughn settled in to wait, fighting the growing knot of worry in his gut. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in deepening shades of gold and crimson. Still no sign of Zara. As dusk approached, Vaughn's vigilance was rewarded by the sight of dust in the distance, riders, moving fast, heading in the direction of his ranch. He counted 5 men, and even from this distance, he recognized the distinctive silhouette of the scarred man, Ryder, leading them. They hadn't found Zara, then. They were returning to the ranch, expecting to find both her and Vaughn there. Relief washed over him, followed quickly by renewed concern. If Zara had successfully evaded Prescott's men, where was she now? The answer came just as the sun dipped below the horizon. A slight movement at the base of the mesa, too deliberate to be wildlife. Vaughn raised the rifle, peering through the gathering gloom, his finger poised near the trigger. "Vaughn!" The soft call drifted up from below. "It's me." He nearly collapsed with relief. "Up here," he called back, keeping his voice low. "Follow the path on the eastern side." Minutes later, Zara appeared at the top of the path, dust-covered and weary, but blessedly unharmed. Without thinking, Vaughn pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Don't ever do that again," he murmured into her hair. "Drawing them off like that. You could have been killed." Zara pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting his in the fading light. "I couldn't risk them finding you with the journal. It's our only hope." "You're impossible," Vaughn said, though there was no anger in his voice now. "And incredibly brave." A smile touched her lips. "I had a good teacher these past few days." For a moment, they simply stood there, holding each other as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above them. Then, reluctantly, Vaughn stepped back. "Prescott's men are at the ranch," he informed her. "I saw them riding in as the sun was setting. 5 of them, including Ryder." Zara nodded, unsurprised. "I led them on a chase to the north before doubling back. They'll be angry when they find the ranch empty." "Let them be angry," Vaughn said grimly. "By the time they figure out where we've gone, Marshal Turner will be on his way." He quickly updated her on his conversation with Reynolds, watching hope bloom in her eyes at the news. "So we just need to stay hidden until the marshal arrives," she said. 2 days at most. "That's the plan," Vaughn confirmed. "Though I doubt Prescott will give up easily. Once his men report back, he'll know we're still in the area." They settled in a sheltered hollow at the top of the mesa, sharing the food Vaughn had brought and speaking in low voices as full darkness descended. The night was clear, the desert sky ablaze with stars that seemed close enough to touch. "It's beautiful," Zara murmured, gazing upward. "Even with everything that's happening, I can't help but find peace in that sky." Vaughn followed her gaze. "My father used to say that the stars remind us how small our troubles really are." Was he right? "Not entirely," Vaughn replied thoughtfully. "Some troubles are genuinely big, but the stars do remind us that we're part of something larger, something enduring." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, shoulders touching, the warmth of their bodies a counterpoint to the cooling desert air. "Zara," Vaughn finally said, his voice soft in the darkness, "when this is over, when Prescott is dealt with, what will you do?" She turned to look at him, her face silvered by starlight. "I haven't thought that far ahead. Find another teaching position, perhaps. Start over somewhere new. Or you could stay," Vaughn suggested, his heart pounding. "Here, with me." Zara's breath caught audibly. "Vaughn, I know it's fast," he continued, the words tumbling out now. "We've known each other less than a week. But these days with you, I've never felt more certain of anything in my life. We barely know each other, she whispered, though she made no move to pull away from him. I know enough, Vaughn insisted. I know you're brave and principled and willing to risk everything for what's right. I know you can make things grow in the desert. I know that when I think about the future of this ranch, I can't imagine it without you in it. Zara's eyes glistened in the starlight. And I know that you're the first man I've ever met who made me believe in the possibility of a true partnership, who saw me as an equal, not someone to be protected or controlled. Her hand found his in the darkness. But Vaughn, my reputation, will be restored when the truth comes out, he finished firmly. And even if it isn't, do you think I care what others say? This is our land, Zara. Our life to build as we choose. Our land. Our life. The words hung between them, full of promise and possibility. Slowly, inevitably, they drew together, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt both like a beginning and a completion. Vaughn's hand cradled her face gently, mindful of her injury, as hers gripped the front of his shirt as if anchoring herself to him. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Zara rested her forehead against his. Yes, she said simply. Yes. Yes, I'll stay. When this is over, I want to build something here. With you. The joy that flooded through Vaughn was almost painful in its intensity. He kissed her again, pouring all his unspoken feelings into the connection between them. Above them, a shooting star blazed across the velvet darkness, a promise, it seemed, written in the heavens themselves. But their moment of perfect happiness was shattered by the distant sound of horses approaching, multiple riders, moving fast through the desert night. They sprang apart, instantly alert. Vaughn reached for the rifle, moving to the edge of the mesa to peer into the darkness below. How many? Zara whispered, crouching beside him. Can't tell yet, he replied tensely. But they're heading straight for us. Somehow, impossibly, Prescott's men had found them. And from the sound of it, there were more than 5 riders now. The brief peace they had found beneath the stars was about to be tested in fire. The riders materialized out of the darkness like specters. 8 men, moving with purpose toward the base of the mesa. In the lead was not Ryder, as Vaughn had expected, but Victor Prescott himself, his tall figure unmistakable even in the dim starlight. They must have been watching the mesa, Zara whispered, her face pale in the darkness. Waiting for one of us to show ourselves. Or they had trackers, Vaughn suggested grimly. Either way, they've got us cornered. The riders halted at the base of the mesa, directly below the path that led to the summit. Prescott's voice carried clearly in the still night air. Daniels, Preston, we know you're up there. There's nowhere left to run. Vaughn and Zara exchanged glances. He could see his own determination mirrored in her eyes. They would not surrender, not now, not after coming so far. What do you want, Prescott? Vaughn called back, keeping his position hidden. A harsh laugh drifted upward. You know exactly what I want. The journal. The woman. Submit now, and perhaps I'll let you walk away from this, Daniels. Continue this foolishness, and neither of you will leave this place alive. Big talk from a man who beats children, Vaughn responded, his voice cutting through the night. How do you think the territorial court will view your actions when they hear Margaret's testimony? A moment of silence followed, then Prescott's voice, now edged with genuine rage. You leave my daughter out of this, you sanctimonious bastard. Why? Vaughn pressed. Afraid of what she might say? Afraid of the truth coming to light? The truth, Prescott spat, is that you're harboring a thief and a liar. A woman who tried to poison my daughter against me with her outlandish accusations. The truth, Zara suddenly called, moving to stand beside Vaughn, is written in your daughter's fearful eyes every time you approach her. It's written in the bruises you leave on her, in the nightmares she suffers, in the way she flinches at sudden movements. You have 1 minute to come down, Prescott responded coldly, or we start shooting. Vaughn pulled Zara back from the edge. We have the high ground, he said quickly, and it would take them time to climb the path. We can hold them off. For how long? Zara asked practically. They outnumber us 4 to 1, and we have limited ammunition. Long enough, Vaughn hoped. Reynolds is sending word to Marshal Turner. If we can just hold out until morning. A shot rang out, the bullet striking rock somewhere to their left. Another followed, then several more warning shots, designed to demonstrate the seriousness of Prescott's threat. Your minute is up, Prescott called. Last chance. Instead of answering, Vaughn raised Reynolds' rifle, took careful aim at a spot near the group of riders, and fired. The shot kicked up dust at the horse's feet, causing several to rear in panic. "That was a warning," Vaughn shouted. "The next one won't be. Leave now, Prescott, before this gets worse." Laughter drifted up from below, not Prescott's, but a deeper, more menacing sound. Ryder's voice carried clearly. "Boss, let me and the boys handle this. We'll bring them down quick." "Do it," Prescott ordered, his voice cold with finality. What followed was a nightmarish game of cat and mouse. 3 of Prescott's men began ascending the path to the mesa top, using the scrubby vegetation for cover, while the others maintained a steady barrage of covering fire that forced Vaughn and Zara to keep their heads down. Vaughn managed to pick off one of the ascending men with a well-placed shot, sending him tumbling back down the path with a cry of pain. But the other 2 continued their advance, moving from cover to cover with practiced efficiency. "We need to move," Vaughn urged, pulling Zara toward the opposite side of the mesa. "If they reach the top, we'll be trapped." They scrambled across the flat expanse, staying low, until they reached the far edge. Below them lay a steep drop, almost sheer in places, but with enough handholds and ledges to potentially allow a descent. "Can you climb down?" Vaughn asked, assessing the drop dubiously. Zara peered over the edge. "I think so. But Vaughn, what about you? You can't shoot and climb." He made a quick decision. "I'll hold them off while you descend. Once you're safely down, I'll follow." "No," Zara objected immediately. "I won't leave you here alone." "You have to," Vaughn insisted, pressing the journal into her hands. "Take this. Get to Reynolds. He'll help you reach the marshal even if He couldn't finish the thought. Tears glistened in Zara's eyes, visible even in the darkness. "Don't ask me to leave you." The sound of boots scraping on rock from the path behind them made the decision for them. Prescott's men had almost reached the top. "Go," Vaughn urged, giving her a gentle push toward the edge. "I'll be right behind you." With a last, anguished look, Zara began her descent, finding footholds in the rough surface of the mesa wall. Vaughn turned back, rifle ready, as the first of Prescott's men crested the top of the path. He fired, missing narrowly as the man ducked back. But the shot bought precious seconds for Zara to descend further, seconds closer to dawn and the hope of rescue. A gun battle erupted across the mesa top, with Vaughn using every bit of cover he could find, firing sparingly to make his ammunition last. One more of Prescott's men fell, clutching his shoulder. But they kept coming, and Vaughn found himself being steadily pushed back toward the edge where Zara had descended. A bullet grazed his arm, searing pain following the path of the lead. Another tore through his hat. His own shots were becoming less accurate as fatigue and stress took their toll. And then, just as it seemed the end was inevitable, a new sound carried through the night. Hoofbeats, many of them, approaching fast from the south. "Boss," one of Prescott's men called from below. "Riders coming." Vaughn risked a glance over his shoulder and saw a welcome sight. At least a dozen horsemen approaching at a gallop, led by a familiar figure on a paint horse. Reynolds. The distraction proved costly. Something struck Vaughn from behind. Not a bullet, but the butt of a rifle wielded by one of Prescott's men who had managed to circle around him. Pain exploded at the base of his skull, and he stumbled, falling to one knee. Through blurred vision, he saw a rider approaching, revolver leveled at his chest. "End of the line, Daniels." Vaughn braced himself for the shot. Instead, a rock came hurtling out of the darkness, striking Ryder squarely in the face. The scarred man howled in pain, his shot going wild. From just below the edge of the mesa, Zara pulled herself back up, another rock already in her hand. "Get away from him," she snarled, her face fierce in the starlight. The moment's distraction was all Vaughn needed. He lunged forward, tackling Ryder around the waist, and sending them both rolling across the mesa top. They grappled desperately, each fighting for control of Ryder's gun. Below, the sound of gunfire erupted as Reynolds' men engaged with Prescott's remaining forces. Shouts and the thunder of hooves filled the night air. The gun between them discharged, the bullet passing harmlessly into the sky. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Vaughn wrenched the weapon from Ryder's grasp and brought it down hard against the man's temple. Ryder went limp beneath him. Panting, bleeding from his arm and a dozen smaller cuts, Vaughn staggered to his feet to find Zara standing before him. her face a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "I told you to keep going," he gasped, reaching for her nonetheless. "And I decided not to listen," she replied, stepping into his embrace. "I'm stubborn that way." From below, a familiar voice called up. "Daniels. Preston. You two still alive up there?" "Reynolds." And beside him, Vaughn now saw, was a tall figure wearing a marshal's badge that caught the starlight as he approached. "We're here," Vaughn called back. "And we have quite a story for the marshal." Dawn broke over the desert in a riot of color, illuminating a scene of unexpected resolution at the base of the mesa. Marshal Turner, a stern-faced man with keen eyes and a deliberate manner, had taken control with impressive efficiency upon his arrival with Reynolds. Prescott and his remaining men had been disarmed and now sat under guard, their expressions ranging from sullen defiance to outright fear. Ryder, still groggy from Vaughn's blow, had his hands bound behind him. Vaughn and Zara, exhausted but triumphant, presented their case to the marshal. The journal, their testimonies, and Reynolds' corroboration of the community's long-standing suspicions about Prescott's treatment of his daughter. "This is absurd," Prescott blustered, though his earlier confidence had visibly eroded. "The word of a thief and a newcomer against a respected businessman? You're exceeding your authority, Turner." The marshal regarded him coolly. "My authority extends to investigating allegations of child abuse, Mr. Prescott, as well as attempted murder, when men under your command open fire on unarmed citizens." "I never ordered," Prescott began, but Turner cut him off. "Save it for the territorial court," the marshal advised. "I'll be escorting you to the capital personally, and I'll be interviewing your daughter with a physician present." For the first time, genuine fear flashed across Prescott's face. "You have no right to speak to Margaret. She's my daughter, and under the protection of territorial law," Turner replied implacably, "as are all children in Arizona." As the marshal organized the prisoners for transport back to Holbrook, Reynolds approached Vaughn and Zara, who sat together on a fallen log, their hands intertwined. "You two look like you've been through a war," the older rancher observed, his gruff tone belied by the concern in his eyes. "But you held your ground. Not many would have had the courage." "We had help," Vaughn acknowledged gratefully. "Your timing was impeccable." Reynolds shrugged modestly. "When I couldn't find the marshal right away, I gathered some neighbors who've had their own run-ins with Prescott over the years. Turns out, quite a few were willing to ride against him, given the chance." "What happens now?" Zara asked, looking toward where Prescott sat in stony silence. "Now," Marshal Turner said, joining their conversation, "Mr. Prescott will face territorial justice. His influence won't help him much once word of his actions spreads." The marshal turned to Zara. "Miss Preston, I owe you an apology. When you first came to me with your concerns, I allowed Prescott's standing to influence my judgment." "You're making it right now," Zara said simply. "That's what matters." Turner nodded, his expression grave. "I'll need both of you to testify at his trial. And Miss Preston, your detailed records will be invaluable in building the case." "What about Margaret?" Zara asked, concern evident in her voice. "What will happen to her?" "She has family in San Francisco, I believe," Turner replied. "An aunt. Once I've interviewed her and confirmed your allegations, arrangements will be made for her care." As the marshal moved away to oversee the preparations for departure, Vaughn turned to Zara, reaching up to gently touch the bruise on her temple. "It's over," he said softly. "Prescott can't hurt you anymore. Can't hurt anyone. Thanks to you," she replied, leaning into his touch. "You believed me when no one else would." "I believed in you," Vaughn corrected. "There's a difference." Reynolds cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, I should help the marshal get these miscreants organized. Daniels, I assume you and Miss Preston will be heading back to your ranch." Vaughn looked at Zara questioningly. "That depends. Is that still our plan?" A slow smile spread across her face. "I believe someone promised me a future under these desert stars." "I believe someone accepted," Vaughn replied, his heart lighter than it had been in days, despite his exhaustion and injuries. Reynolds looked between them, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Well now, that's fine news. This territory could use more good people putting down roots." He extended his hand to Vaughn. "Neighbor." As Reynolds walked away, Vaughn pulled Zara gently to her feet. "Let's go home." "Home," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes, let's." Epilogue. 6 months later, the transformation of Holbrook's promise was remarkable to behold. What had once been a dilapidated homestead now stood as a thriving small ranch, with a modest herd of cattle grazing on the renewed pastures, a garden bursting with produce despite the desert climate, and a house that glowed with warmth and welcome in the gathering twilight. On the porch, Vaughn Daniels sat beside his wife of 3 months, their rocking chairs moving in gentle unison as they watched the sunset paint the sky in familiar hues of gold and crimson. "Letter from Margaret today," Zara said, passing him the envelope. "She sounds happy in San Francisco. Her aunt has enrolled her in a fine school, and she's making friends." Vaughn smiled as he scanned the childish handwriting. "She asked when we'll visit." "Perhaps in the spring," Zara suggested, "after the calving season." The trial of Victor Prescott had been the sensation of the territory, ending with his conviction on multiple charges of child abuse and attempted murder. His financial empire had crumbled in the aftermath, with many of his former allies distancing themselves once his true nature was revealed. For Zara, the verdict had brought vindication and the restoration of her good name. She had received offers to return to teaching, but had chosen instead to remain at Holbrook's Promise, where she now divided her time between tending their growing homestead and teaching the children of neighboring ranches 3 days a week in the small schoolroom Vaughn had built for her adjacent to their home. Their wedding had been a simple affair, held beneath the desert stars on the very mesa where they had made their stand against Prescott. Reynolds had stood as Vaughn's best man, and to their surprise, Marshall Turner had ridden from the capital to attend, bringing with him official pardons expunging any remaining legal clouds from Zara's name. Now, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Vaughn reached over to take his wife's hand in his. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question he still posed occasionally, as if marveling at their extraordinary journey from strangers to partners in every sense. Zara's answer never varied. "Not one," she said, her fingers tightening around his. "Though I still think it was rather forward of you to propose after knowing me less than a week." "What can I say?" Vaughn grinned. "When you find a mysterious woman living in your ranch house, you don't ask too many questions. You just thank your lucky stars." Zara laughed, the sound still the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. "Is that what they call me in town? Your mysterious woman?" "Among other things," Vaughn teased. "Mrs. Daniels being the most common these days." She leaned over to kiss him softly, her lips warm against his in the cooling evening air. "I like the sound of that." Above them, the stars emerged one by one, witnesses to a love that had bloomed against all odds in this harsh but beautiful land. A love born of courage and principle, nurtured by shared purpose, and now flourishing under the vast, eternal canopy of desert stars. It wasn't the beginning Vaughn had imagined when he first laid eyes on his rundown inheritance. It was something far better, a beginning shared, a promise fulfilled, and a future brighter than either of them could have dreamed. "I love you," he whispered against her hair as they held each other close on the porch of the home they had built together. "And I love you," Zara replied, "until the stars fall from the sky." In the distance, a shooting star blazed across the heavens, not an ending, but a testament to the enduring light that can be found even in the darkest night, when two hearts find their way to each other against all odds.